Chapter 3, Red Boy. So it was that Sari and Ben and Nemat came to live in the little mud brick house not far from Coffee's fields. Even though they were slaves, they were very happy, for they had plenty of food to eat and a good home and a kind master and mistress. Soon Ben was strong enough to work all day in the fields. Nemat spent many hours in the little courtyard of their home working at her loom. It was not long before she could weave linen as fine and even as silk. Sometimes Sari helped her by twisting the flax fibers into thread, but most of the time she was up at the villa or off somewhere with Coffee. Sari and Coffee could not talk to each other very much at first because Sari could not speak Egyptian, but she soon learned. When they were out in the fields, Coffee would point to the plow that the slaves were using and say, "Plow." Sari would repeat it after him, and then they would both laugh at the way she said it. It was not long before she understood everything Coffee said. "Go and get my ball, Sari," he would say, remembering that she was his slave and that he should be ordering her about, and Sari would run off to find it. Then they would have a game, and Coffee would forget again that she was his slave, and they would just have a good time playing together. One bright morning, they were sitting on the grass under the big fig tree in the center of Coffee's field. All around them, the slaves were working. Coffee explained to Sari what they were doing. "You see," he said, "first the slaves have to plow the land. That leaves the earth in big lumps, so they take mallets and pound it fine. Then they water the fields and sow the seed. The men down there at the end of the field are just finishing. They carry the seed in those little baskets, and the men working just behind them are raking soil over the seeds." "I see," said Sari. "What are they going to do after that?" "They will get the oxen and drive them all around the field to trample the seeds into the ground." As he said that, Coffee had an idea. "I know," he cried. "Let's ask Ani if we can go and get the oxen and drive them down here." Ani was the slave who had charge of the farming. Together the children ran down the field. "I say, Ani," called Coffee. "Yes, Master Coffee," Ani smiled at the two children. "May we get the oxen for you?" asked Coffee. "You will soon be ready to use them." "Why, yes," said Ani good-naturedly. "You may if you want to. Only remember," he called after them as they ran off, "Red Boy is in the pasture too, so be sure to fasten the gate." Red Boy was Sokaris's prize bull, and he was very fond of getting out through unlatched gates. "Well, we'll remember," Coffee promised. It was quite a long way to the pasture, and it was hard walking over the freshly plowed ground. By the time they reached the pasture, both children were hot and tired, so they climbed up on the gate and sat there to cool off. "See," said Coffee, "there is Red Boy down at the other end of the pasture." "Red Boy," he called. Red Boy raised his head, rolled one eye at Coffee and Sari, and then went back to grazing. He was a handsome bull, all reddish-brown except for a white streak on his nose and a broad white patch on his chest. "He's the best fighting bull around here," boasted Coffee. "You'll see him fight at harvest time. He's wonderful." "What does he fight?" asked Sari. She glanced at Red Boy's smooth horns. They looked very sharp. "Other bulls, of course," said Coffee. "What did you think he fought? Crocodiles?" "I just wondered," said Sari. Red Boy had raised his head again and stood gazing at them. He looked very fierce. "Do you have to go into the pasture to get the oxen?" she asked. "Oh, no," said Coffee. "You do it like this." He picked a handful of grass that was growing beside the gate. "You pick some too," he said to Sari. He leaned over the gate and held out the grass. "Here, Soot, here, Nep," he called. "They know their names," he explained, "and they'll come to get the grass." The two oxen lumbered slowly toward the gate, and Coffee kept calling them and waving his handful of grass at them. Sari waved hers and called too. Finally, Coffee opened the gate, and the two great beasts lumbered through. "Look out, Sari, don't let him go into the garden," warned Coffee as Nep started off toward the vegetable garden. "He's very fond of lettuce, and he'll trample everything. Show him the grass, and he'll follow you." Sari did as she was told, but Nep had made up his mind to have lettuce and paid no attention to her. "Wait, I'll get him," called Coffee, slamming the gate behind him. It made a loud noise and sounded as if it were closed, and Coffee was in a hurry, so he didn't look to see. He caught up with Nep and kicked him gently. After that, Nep abandoned the idea of lettuce and both oxen trotted off toward Coffee's field with the two children running in front of them, urging them on with their bunches of grass. Red Boy watched them go. Perhaps his feelings were hurt because he had been left behind with the rams and cows, or perhaps he just wanted to see where Sut and Nep were going. Anyway, he walked slowly to the gate and hung his head over it. Then he lowered his head and pushed the gate gently. Nothing happened, so he pushed harder and still a little harder, and the gate swung open. Red Boy poked his nose through, then his shoulders, and pretty soon all of him was on the other side. He was a little surprised, but it was pleasant to be outside the pasture. He flicked the flies away with his tail and started off after Sut and Nep and the children. The farther he got from the pasture, the friskier he felt. He pawed up some earth, then he felt still better, and then he began to run. Coffee and Sorry had reached the field when Sorry happened to look behind her, and there was Red Boy tearing over the rough ground, his head lowered, kicking his heels in the air. Sorry screamed, and Coffee turned to see what was the matter. He didn't waste any time screaming. He just seized Sorry's hand and ran as fast as he could for the fig tree. He shouted as he ran, "Ani, Ani, Red Boy's loose!" Red Boy heard the screaming and shouting. To him, they meant only one thing, and that thing was a fight. Everybody screamed and shouted when he fought, so he looked around for something to fight. And there were two little figures running as fast as they could to get away from him. The slaves were running too, but Red Boy saw Coffee and Sorry first, so he started after them. The plowed ground was hard to run on, and Red Boy could run much faster than Sorry and Coffee could. It seemed to them that he must surely overtake them before they got to the tree. Twice Sorry slipped and almost fell, but Coffee pulled her up and they stumbled on. At last, when Sorry thought she could not run another step, Coffee reached up, grasped a branch of the tree, and scrambled up, half dragging Sorry after him. They were not a moment too soon. Red Boy reached the tree only a few seconds after they did. He was enraged because the children had gotten away from him. He tore up the grass under the tree and ran at the trunk with his horns. Then he gave it up and rushed off around the field, bellowing as he went. Coffee was nearly in tears. Look what he's doing to my field," he wailed. Sorry wailed too. And what with the slaves shouting and Red Boy bellowing and everybody running from all directions giving orders, there was quite a commotion. Every time a slave tried to catch Red Boy, he would lower his horns and run right at the man, and the slave would have to run away and jump the ditch that surrounded the field to save himself. At last, Coffee saw his father coming across the fields with his mother and Nemat close behind. As soon as he reached the field, Socaris ordered everybody to stop trying to catch Red Boy. They let him caper around the field until he was tired out. Then Ben slipped a halter over the bull's neck and led him out of the field and back to the pasture. After that, everybody ran to the fig tree. "Are you all right?" called Nasha and Socaris as Nemat at the same time. "Yes," said Coffee and Sorry from their perch among the branches. Nasha sighed with relief. She was so glad that the children were not hurt that she laughed and said, "Well, if you don't look like two frightened wild fowls up there, come down." Coffee and Sorry looked down at the ground. It seemed a long way off. "We can't get down," they cried. "It's too far." So Socaris chuckled. "Then how did you get up there?" he asked. "I don't know," wailed Coffee. "We didn't have time to think about it." Everybody laughed, and someone reached up and helped them down. Then they all walked back to the villa. Nothing was said about Red Boy until after they had eaten their lunch. Then, when they were sitting out in the arbor, Coffee said, "It was my fault, Father, that Red Boy got out. I didn't fasten the gate." Said Socaris. "You know that your field will have to be planted all over again, Coffee." "Yes," replied Coffee unhappily. "That means," said Socaris, "that I shall have to give you more seed. I can't afford to have seed wasted because a bull tears up your field. What do you think we had better do about it?" Coffee thought for a minute. "Well," he said at last, "if you will trust me until harvest, I will give you one of my copper rings to pay for the seed. Will that be all right?" Socaris nodded. "Yes, I think that will be satisfactory," he said. "And promise Coffee I'll never, never leave that gate open again." "No, I don't believe you will," said his father comfortingly.